Take a slow, steady breath before you continue reading this, because what is being shared with you is not something simple, easy, or light. This message did not find its way to this exact moment without effort, struggle, silence, and emotional difficulty. There is a reason these words are reaching you now, and there is a reason they may feel heavier than an ordinary message. Something has been building beneath the surface for much longer than you may realize. This message has traveled through long stretches of silence, emotional distance, uncertainty, and hidden pain that remained locked inside for quite some time before finally making its way into the present moment. What it carries feels more significant now than it ever did before. There is something underneath the silence that can no longer remain completely hidden. So stay fully present with these words, because they may touch something that has been running very deeply beneath the surface of your life and your connection with another person. There is a person in your life who has been holding something inside their heart for far longer than they would ever willingly admit. They have carried these feelings quietly, privately, and sometimes even painfully. This has continued for much longer than you probably suspected or imagined. They did not simply wake up one morning and suddenly decide that their feelings had disappeared. They did not genuinely move forward in the way their actions may have appeared to suggest from the outside. What actually happened was much quieter, slower, and more complicated than the behavior they allowed other people to see. If you want the full, urgent message from this person, take a moment and hit like right now, so this message can reach more hearts and find the people who may need to hear it at this exact moment. They pushed their real emotions down because, at the time, they honestly did not know what else they could do with everything they were feeling. Instead of confronting those emotions, they covered them carefully and placed them somewhere deep inside where nobody else could see them. They convinced themselves that remaining quiet would be easier. They told themselves that staying distant would be simpler than explaining what was happening inside their heart. They believed silence could protect them from difficult conversations, uncomfortable emotions, and the possibility of being vulnerable. But feelings that are buried deeply inside do not simply disappear because someone refuses to acknowledge them. They remain there. They wait quietly beneath everything else. Sometimes they become even heavier with every passing day, every passing week, and every moment spent pretending that nothing is wrong. A person can distract themselves, stay busy, meet other people, focus on work, fill their schedule, and convince themselves that they have moved on. But none of those things automatically erase what was never truly resolved. And eventually, all of that emotional weight can rise back to the surface at once. That is exactly where this message seems to be coming from right now. It is not arriving from a place of complete courage, calmness, or inner certainty. It is coming from fear, panic, regret, and from the painful realization that perhaps too much time has already passed without them doing what they should have done. There is a growing awareness inside them that time does not wait forever, and that opportunities which are ignored long enough may eventually disappear. Something shifted inside this person very recently, and the change was significant enough that they could no longer continue pretending everything was fine. Perhaps they encountered something that suddenly reminded them strongly of you. Maybe they saw something familiar, heard a song, passed a place connected to a memory, or came across something that carried your presence in an unexpected way. Perhaps your name was mentioned somewhere when they least expected it. Maybe someone said something that brought an old memory rushing back into their mind. Or perhaps nothing obvious happened at all. Perhaps life simply became quiet enough for the truth inside them to become louder than every distraction they had been using to drown it out. When the noise finally disappeared, the emotions they had been avoiding were still there. They could no longer hide behind busyness, distance, pride, or excuses. Whatever the exact trigger may have been, Something shook them out of the emotional safety zone where they had been hiding for so long. One thought suddenly landed with enormous force inside their mind. They may actually lose you for good. Not temporarily, not just for a little while, permanently. And that thought frightened them more than they expected. It did not arrive gently. It did not come during a crowded afternoon when they could easily distract themselves and move on to something else. It came during a quiet moment when there was nowhere left to run. It may have happened late at night, when the room was silent, when their phone was quiet, and when there were no messages waiting to occupy their attention. It may have happened while they were alone with their own thoughts and had no external noise strong enough to drown out what their heart was saying. Other people's company may have started to feel strangely empty. Conversations that once distracted them may have felt hollow. Smiles may have felt forced. Social situations may have seemed less meaningful than before. They began noticing the difference between simply having people around them and actually feeling understood by someone. When everyday life finally became still, the silence began asking questions they could no longer avoid. Who really understood them? Who listened without immediately judging? Who gave them patience when they struggled to explain themselves? Who could recognize what they were feeling, even when they could not find the right words? And slowly, painfully, your presence became part of the answer. Nobody else carries exactly what you carried in your heart for them. Nobody else listens in quite the same patient way you once listened to them. Nobody else understood certain parts of them without forcing them to explain every single detail. Nobody else offered the same kind of emotional comfort without making them feel trapped, controlled, or pressured. They may have encountered other people. They may have spoken to others. They may even have tried to convince themselves that someone else could eventually provide what they once received from you. But there is a difference between replacing someone's presence and replacing the emotional experience that person created. That difference is becoming clearer to them now. The moment this truth became impossible to ignore, the urgency inside them began to grow. But listen carefully to this part, because it matters more than you may realize. This urgency is not made entirely from love. It is also connected to a deep fear of losing something valuable. They are beginning to understand that when something meaningful is finally gone, it cannot always be recovered simply because you suddenly realize its value. Sometimes, realization comes too late. Sometimes, understanding arrives after distance has already changed everything. Sometimes a person only understands what they had after they finally feel what life is like without it. And that is where this person seems to be emotionally right now. If they could speak to you without pride standing between you, without fear blocking their words, and without excuses creating another wall between their real feelings and what they actually want to say, they would probably admit something very simple. They should have done more. They should have spoken sooner. They should not have allowed so much time to pass. They believed they had more time than they truly had. They assumed your care would remain available no matter how long they stayed silent. They thought your patience would continue indefinitely. They believed that if they waited long enough, they could always come back and explain everything later. But they are beginning to understand that silence has consequences. Silence can hurt someone deeply. Silence can create distance. Silence can change the way another person sees you. And eventually, silence can make someone stop waiting. They are starting to realize that doing nothing was never really doing nothing. Choosing not to speak was still a decision. Choosing not to reach out was still a decision. Choosing distance was still a decision. And every one of those decisions carried consequences. That realization weighs heavily on them now, because they can see how their own choices affected the closeness that once existed between you. They carry guilt for not being present when their presence mattered most. They carry regret for remaining quiet when honest words were desperately needed. They regret the moments when they could have opened their heart, but instead chose distance. They regret the times when they could have explained themselves, but allowed pride to keep their mouth closed. They know there were moments when honesty could have changed everything. At the time, however, distance felt safer. Silence felt easier to control. Avoidance felt less frightening than vulnerability. They believed that if they did not confront the situation, they could somehow control the outcome. But avoiding something difficult never truly protects a person from the pain connected to it. It only delays that pain. Sometimes it allows the pain to grow larger until it eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Type urgent in the comments if you feel that this message is meant for you, because there is something about this situation that may be resonating with a part of your experience that words alone cannot easily explain. This person does not necessarily struggle with feelings because they feel too little. In many ways, they struggle because they feel much more than they know how to process, express, or manage. Their emotions became overwhelming, and instead of learning how to communicate them, they attempted to suppress them. Opening up to you would have required real emotional risk. It would have meant admitting that you mattered. It would have meant accepting the possibility of rejection. It would have meant allowing you to see a side of them they normally kept protected. It would have meant surrendering the emotional control they had spent so much time trying to maintain. And for someone who is uncomfortable with vulnerability, that can feel terrifying. They may have convinced themselves that they were protecting their peace when they were actually protecting their defenses. They may have called it independence when it was really avoidance. They may have called it moving on when part of them was simply trying not to feel. There is an old psychological truth that when hidden patterns remain unconscious, they can continue influencing a person's choices without that person fully realizing what is happening. Instead of recognizing the pattern, they may call it fate, bad timing, circumstances, or bad luck. Something very similar seems to have happened here. Instead of listening to what their heart was genuinely telling them, they allowed fear to make important decisions for them. They let pride speak louder than emotion. They allowed uncertainty to become an excuse for staying silent. They allowed distance to become their answer, even when their feelings were telling them something completely different. And now, those old choices have turned into consequences they cannot simply overlook. They are beginning to understand that every choice creates a direction. Every delay creates another layer of distance. Every unspoken truth eventually becomes something that has to be faced. There is another, deeper layer to all of this, and it may be weighing on them even more heavily than the regret itself. They can sense that you are no longer the same person you once were. Something about you has changed. Something in your energy, your attitude, your responses, and the way you carry yourself feels different to them now. Perhaps you no longer respond the way you once did. Perhaps you do not chase explanations anymore. Perhaps you stopped waiting for them to make the first move. Maybe you became quieter, more self-contained, or more emotionally detached. And they notice. They may not openly admit that they notice, but they feel the difference. The version of you who once waited patiently may not be standing in the same emotional place anymore. The person who once made endless room for their silence may now have stronger boundaries. The person who once tried to understand every confusing action may no longer feel the need to solve every mystery. And that change is forcing them to look at themselves differently. Before, they may have assumed you would always be there. Now they are wondering whether that assumption was their greatest mistake. They are beginning to realize that your patience was not weakness. Your silence was not permission. Your understanding did not mean you would tolerate everything forever. Your love, care, attention, or emotional availability was something valuable. And they may have recognized its value only after they began to feel its absence. That is why the energy around this situation feels so urgent. It is not simply about missing someone. It is about realizing that someone who once felt emotionally close may now be moving beyond your reach. And that realization can create a completely different kind of fear. They may be asking themselves whether they waited too long. They may be wondering if you still care. They may be questioning whether you would even respond if they finally reached out. They may be replaying old conversations in their mind, remembering moments when you tried to connect and they pulled away. They may be remembering the things you said, the things they failed to say, and the opportunities they allowed to pass without taking action. There is a painful difference between having a chance and realizing afterward that the chance was real. They are beginning to understand that now. They thought they could keep everything under control by staying quiet. But emotions do not always follow the rules people create for themselves. A heart can remain attached even when the mind insists it should move forward. A memory can remain powerful even after a person tells themselves they no longer care. And a connection can continue to affect someone even when they outwardly behave as though it means nothing. That may be why the silence around this person has felt so strange. The silence does not necessarily mean there is nothing happening. Sometimes silence means there is too much happening internally. Sometimes a person becomes quiet because they are trying to understand emotions they never expected to feel this strongly. Sometimes they withdraw because they are afraid of what they might reveal if they finally speak. Sometimes the person who appears the most detached is actually fighting the strongest internal battle. And right now, this person may be standing at the edge of a realization they can no longer escape. They cannot keep pretending forever. They cannot keep telling themselves that time will solve everything. They cannot keep assuming that you will always remain exactly where they left you. Because you are changing. Life is changing. And the connection itself has changed. The question now is not whether they ever felt something. The deeper question is whether they will finally have the courage to face what they have been feeling all along. They may still have fear. They may still have pride. They may still hesitate. But the difference is that the consequences of doing nothing are finally becoming clearer to them. They are beginning to understand that losing someone does not always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes you lose someone slowly. You lose them through every unanswered message, every postponed conversation, every avoided truth, every moment when you could have shown up but decided not to. And perhaps that is the realization that hurts them the most. They may finally understand that the distance they created was not simply distance between two people. It was distance between what they truly wanted and what they were brave enough to admit. Now the silence is no longer protecting them. It is revealing everything. And somewhere inside them, there may be a growing desire to undo what can still be undone, to say what should have been said, and to acknowledge what should never have been ignored. Whether they act on that realization is another matter, but the realization itself has already changed something inside them. They are looking backward differently now. They are remembering differently. They are feeling differently. And most importantly, they are beginning to see you differently. Not as someone who would simply remain available forever, but as someone whose presence had real value. Someone whose absence can actually be felt. Someone whose silence can now speak louder than all the words they once refused to hear. And that is why the shift you are sensing may not be imaginary. Something has changed in the emotional landscape between you. The person who once believed there would always be more time may now be realizing that time was never guaranteed. They may finally be facing the one truth they spent so long trying to avoid. You were never as easy to replace as they wanted themselves to believe. And now, perhaps for the first time, they are beginning to understand exactly what that means. Even your quiet presence carries a different quality now, something that was not there before. You may still have some feelings for them, but you are no longer chasing after explanations or searching desperately for clarity. You are no longer repeating yourself again and again, hoping that somehow something will finally change for the better. You are no longer standing in that painful, uncertain space where nothing ever seemed clear, and everything seemed to hurt somewhere deep inside. That change unsettles them in ways they never expected. The reason it affects them so strongly is because they depended on your patience far more than was ever fair or healthy. They depended on your kindness and gentleness while keeping their own heart carefully protected and emotionally closed. Somewhere beneath everything, they simply believed you would always remain there, waiting, understanding, and making room for them. They never seriously imagined that you would eventually reach a point where you quietly decided to put yourself first for once. But you did reach that point, and now they can sense the difference. That quiet shift you made within yourself speaks more loudly to them than any heated argument ever could have. Keep listening carefully, because this is where the truth becomes much sharper and easier to see. What they are afraid of losing is not simply you as a person in their life. They are afraid of losing the rare feeling of being completely seen without being harshly judged for what was seen. They fear losing the emotional safety they never openly admitted they had come to rely on so heavily. They fear losing that unusual space where they could feel understood without being pushed beyond their emotional limits too quickly. Only now are they starting to realize that not every bond can be restored once it has been allowed to fall apart. Not every connection can simply be discovered again inside someone else who enters their life later. That realization follows them wherever they go now. It appears during those quiet moments when there is nothing left to distract them from what they have been trying to keep buried. It rises when they attempt to move forward, but cannot seem to find stable emotional ground beneath themselves. It returns whenever they compare someone new to you and immediately recognize a difference they cannot easily explain away or ignore. This is why the urgency growing inside them continues becoming stronger and more difficult to silence each day. It is not necessarily about controlling you or taking control of the situation again. It is about realizing that time is no longer something they can assume they have an endless supply of. They can feel a door slowly beginning to move toward closing, not through loud drama or anger, and not because of some final declaration. It is happening quietly and gradually, somewhere beneath the surface. That kind of quiet closing can be the most serious kind, because when a door closes softly inside someone's heart, it does not always open again easily. Comment heart if you have someone who has been hiding their true feelings from you, and you feel they want to reach out now. They want to find the right way to explain themselves completely. They want to give an apology that carries genuine meaning, rather than something that sounds defensive, forced, or empty. But fear continues stopping every attempt before it can even begin. Fear makes them wonder whether it is already too late for any of this to matter. Fear whispers that perhaps you no longer care for them in the same way you once did, before everything changed. Fear tells them that if they finally reveal who they truly are, they could face a rejection that would hurt more deeply than they are prepared to handle. So they hesitate and carefully hold their words inside. They create messages in their minds and then completely erase them before they ever send them. They imagine entire conversations inside their heads that never actually take place in real life. They go through every possible outcome they can think of and somehow still remain exactly where they were before. And while they continue postponing the moment, the pressure building inside them keeps becoming heavier without finding any real release. This is not a promise that everything between you will suddenly reach a happy ending. It is not a comfortable story designed to guarantee what will happen next. It is something much closer to an honest confession being felt from a distance, across time, silence, and emotional space. They are not claiming that all the damage has already been repaired. They are not pretending they have suddenly discovered every answer they were missing before. What they are finally beginning to acknowledge, even if only within their most private thoughts, is that treating you as though you would always remain there waiting for them was deeply unfair. They did not fully understand your value until they experienced the emptiness left behind in the space where you once stood. When truth arrives this late, it often carries an additional kind of pain with it, because it arrives together with the realization that they may have lost their hold on something that truly mattered. But what this means for you is more important than what it means for them right now. Listen closely to this part because it matters. This is not telling you to remain standing still and patiently wait for them. It is not asking you to forgive them before your heart is genuinely ready. It is not encouraging you to walk back into the same pain that you already experienced once. It is simply revealing a truth they failed to communicate through their earlier behavior and choices. You mattered to them much more deeply than they ever managed to express openly. Your absence in their life now feels louder than your presence ever seemed when you were completely there beside them. What existed between you was real, even though they handled it badly at the time. The real power in this situation belongs entirely to whatever decision you choose to make from this point forward.